They say fire reveals truth, that when everything burns away, what remains is the essence of what was always there. In 1856, in the red clay hills of Georgia, where the Chattahoochee River carved its ancient path through pine forests and cotton fields, a fire would reveal a truth so terrible that those who witnessed it would carry the horror to their graves. Her name was Mercy Blackwood, though mercy was the last thing she would show the family that owned her. She stood barely 5 feet tall, a small woman with knowing eyes and hands that never seemed to burn, no matter how close she held them to flame. The slaves at Ashford Manor whispered that fire was her ally, her confidant, her tool of justice, in a world that had forgotten what justice meant. But to understand why Ashford Manor burned on that terrible October night, why 11 people perished in flames that consumed everything except one small woman in a blood-stained apron, we must go back to the beginning, back to when Mercy first learned that some people deserved to burn. She was born in the slave quarters of a tobacco plantation in Virginia, the daughter of a woman who died bringing her into the world and a father she would never know. From her earliest memories, Mercy was different. While other children played with corn-husk dolls and stick horses, she played with fire. She would steal matches from the kitchen, coals from the hearth, anything that would give her flame to hold and shape and command. The other slaves thought it was just childhood fascination, the kind of dangerous curiosity that would pass with age and discipline. But Mercy's obsession only grew stronger. By the time she was 10, she could hold burning coals in her bare palms without flinching. By 15, she could walk through bonfire flames without singeing a hair on her head. By 20, she could call fire from nothing, summoning flame from the very air with a whisper and a gesture that seemed to pull heat from the earth itself. Her first master, a tobacco farmer named Jeremiah Kroll, noticed her unusual relationship with fire and put it to practical use. Mercy became the plantation's firekeeper, responsible for maintaining the curing barns where tobacco leaves were dried and processed. It was dangerous work that had claimed the lives of other slaves, but Mercy thrived in the heat and smoke, moving through the burning barns like a spirit born from flame itself. For 10 years, she served Kroll faithfully, if not willingly. She kept his fires burning, cured his tobacco to perfection, and asked for nothing in return except the chance to work alone with her beloved flames. She might have lived her entire life in quiet service if Kroll hadn't made the mistake that would change everything. It happened on a humid August night when the air was thick with the smell of curing tobacco and the promise of rain. Kroll had been drinking, as he often did when the humidity made sleep impossible and his debts pressed down on him like stones. He found himself in the slave quarters, not for the first time, looking for comfort he had no right to demand. He chose badly when he chose Mercy. She was alone in her cabin, as always, tending a small fire in a clay pot that served no practical purpose except to give her flame to commune with in the quiet hours. When Kroll pushed open her door without invitation, when he stepped into her sanctuary with whiskey on his breath and violence in his eyes, he crossed a line that should never be crossed. What happened in that cabin would remain between Mercy and the flames that witnessed it. But when dawn broke over the plantation, Jeremiah Kroll was found in his bed, dead from what appeared to be spontaneous combustion. His body was burned beyond recognition, his bedroom charred and blackened, but strangely, nothing else in the house had been touched by fire. Even the bed-sheets beneath him remained unsinged, as if the flames had consumed only what they intended to destroy. Mercy was questioned, of course, but she had an ironclad alibi. She had been in the curing barns all night, tending the tobacco fires, witnessed by 3 other slaves who swore to her whereabouts. The authorities found no evidence connecting her to Kroll's death. No way she could have been in 2 places at once. But the other slaves knew. They saw the satisfaction in her eyes when she heard the news, saw the way small flames seemed to dance in her palms when she thought no one was watching, saw how the fire in the clay pot had burned brighter that morning than it ever had before. Kroll's estate was liquidated to pay his debts, and Mercy found herself sold to a Georgian cotton planter named Silas Ashford. It was meant to be a fresh start, a new life far from the whispered suspicions that followed her like smoke. Ashford had heard nothing of the strange circumstances surrounding her previous master's death, saw only a skilled worker with an unusual but useful talent for fire management. Ashford Manor was grander than anything Mercy had known before, a sprawling plantation house surrounded by white columns and extensive gardens, with slave quarters that housed nearly 200 souls. Silas Ashford was a man of refined tastes and sophisticated cruelties, the kind of master who prided himself on never raising his voice while systematically destroying the spirits of those he owned. He assigned Mercy to the kitchen, where her fire skills would be put to use, maintaining the cooking hearths and managing the complex system of ovens and smokehouse that fed the plantation's population. The head cook, an elderly woman named Aunt Ruth, welcomed her warmly, grateful for help with the demanding work of preparing meals for so many. For the first time in her life, Mercy found something approaching contentment. The kitchen was a realm of fire and heat, of glowing coals and roasting meats, of bread ovens that breathed like living things. She moved through this domain like a priestess in her temple, tending flames that responded to her touch as if they recognized a kindred spirit. But contentment was a luxury that slavery could never truly provide, and Mercy's peace was shattered within months of her arrival. It began with small cruelties, the kind of casual violence that masters inflicted without thought because they could. A slave girl beaten for breaking a dish. A man whipped for working too slowly. A child sold away from her mother because Ashford needed quick money. Each injustice fed the fire that burned constantly in Mercy's heart. Each cruelty added fuel to a rage that grew hotter with every passing day. She began to watch the Ashford family with calculating eyes, studying their habits and weaknesses the way a general might study enemy fortifications. Silas Ashford was the patriarch, a man in his 50s with thinning hair and soft hands that had never known honest work. He ran his plantation with meticulous attention to profit margins and ruthless disregard for human suffering. His wife Eleanor was a delicate woman who fanned herself constantly and complained about the heat while her slaves labored under the merciless Georgia sun. Their children were even worse. The eldest son, Marcus, was 23 and had inherited his father's cruelty without his business sense. He spent his days riding through the slave quarters with a whip, looking for excuses to inflict punishment. The daughter, Victoria, was 19 and beautiful in the way that Southern belles were expected to be, but her beauty masked a heart as cold as January frost. The youngest, Thomas, was only 16, but already showed signs of following in his brother's footsteps. They lived in luxury, built on the backs of those they owned, surrounded themselves with fine things purchased with blood money, and slept peacefully each night while their slaves huddled in wooden shacks that leaked rain and let in winter wind. They were, Mercy decided, exactly the kind of people who deserved to learn what fire could teach. Her opportunity came in the form of a new arrival, a young woman named Sarah who had been purchased at auction in Savannah. Sarah was barely 18, beautiful and defiant, with eyes that blazed with unbroken spirit despite the chains that bound her. Marcus Ashford noticed her immediately. He began visiting the slave quarters at night, claiming he was checking on the security of his property. But everyone knew what he was really doing, what he intended for the beautiful young woman who refused to break under his gaze. Sarah came to the kitchen during the day, helping with food preparation, and Mercy saw the fear that grew in her eyes as Marcus's visits became more frequent and more threatening. "He's going to take me," Sarah whispered one evening as they worked side by side kneading bread dough. "Tonight, tomorrow night, soon, and there's nothing I can do to stop him." Mercy's hands stilled on the dough, but the fire in the bread oven flared suddenly, flames reaching toward the kitchen ceiling with hungry intensity. "Maybe there is something that can be done," she said quietly. Sarah looked at her with desperate hope. "What do you mean?" Mercy glanced around the kitchen to make sure they were alone, then moved closer to the other woman. "I have certain abilities, gifts that run in my blood. If you're willing to trust me, I can make sure Marcus Ashford never bothers you again." "What kind of gifts?" Sarah asked, though something in Mercy's tone made her both hopeful and afraid. In answer, Mercy held out her hand, palm up, and whispered words in a language Sarah didn't recognize. Flames sprang from her palm, a small fire that burned without fuel or source, dancing in the air above her dark skin. Sarah gasped and stepped back, but Mercy smiled reassuringly. "Fire is my ally," she explained, closing her hand and extinguishing the flame. "It obeys me as other people obey their masters, and it's very hungry for justice." That night, Marcus Ashford died screaming. The fire started in his bedroom, though no one could explain how. He had blown out his lamp before retiring, his windows were closed against the night air, and there was no fireplace or source of ignition anywhere in the room. Yet somehow flames erupted from his very bedclothes, consuming him with such fierce intensity that his screams woke the entire household. By the time his family reached his room, it was too late. Marcus was already dead, his body charred beyond recognition, his bedroom a blackened ruin. But strangely, the fire had spread nowhere else. The walls were scorched but intact, the ceiling damaged but not collapsed, the rest of the house completely untouched. Silas Ashford was devastated by his son's death, but not so grief-stricken that he didn't notice the peculiar circumstances. He ordered an investigation, brought in experts from Atlanta to examine the scene, questioned every slave and servant who might have had access to the bedroom. But they found nothing that could explain how such an intense fire had started in an empty room with no source of ignition. Mercy was questioned like everyone else, but she'd been in the kitchen all night, preparing bread for the next day's meals. Aunt Ruth vouched for her presence, as did 2 other kitchen slaves who had worked late helping with the baking. Her alibi was perfect, her demeanor appropriately sorrowful, her answers consistent and believable, but Sarah knew. She saw the satisfaction that flickered in Mercy's eyes when she heard the news, saw the way the cooking fires seemed to burn brighter that morning, saw how Mercy hummed softly while she worked, a tune that sounded like crackling flames. For a while, peace returned to Ashford Manor. Marcus was buried with great ceremony, mourned by his family and forgotten by the slaves he had terrorized. Silas threw himself into his business with renewed intensity, as if work could fill the void left by his son's death. Eleanor took to her bed with grief and laudanum, emerging only for meals and social obligations. Victoria and Thomas became more subdued, perhaps sensing that their world was less secure than they had believed. But Mercy was far from finished. She had tasted justice, felt the satisfaction of watching a cruel man burn for his sins, and she hungered for more. The Ashford family had built their wealth on generations of suffering, had lived in luxury, while those they owned endured misery and deprivation. One death was not enough to balance those scales. One fire was not sufficient to cleanse that much sin. She began to plan, studying the layout of the manor house with the careful attention of an architect or a general. She noted which rooms were connected, which hallways provided escape routes, which areas would trap occupants if fire blocked the exits. She memorized the family's routines, their sleeping habits, their daily patterns, and she waited for the right moment to strike. That moment came on a humid October night, when the air hung still and heavy, pregnant with the promise of rain that never fell. The Ashfords were hosting a dinner party, entertaining neighboring planters and their wives with fine food and expensive wine. The house blazed with lamplight and candles, filled with laughter and music that drifted out to the slave quarters like mockery. Mercy worked in the kitchen that night, preparing course after course for the privileged guests who consumed the fruits of slave labor without thought or gratitude. She carved roasts with hands that never trembled, stirred sauces with wooden spoons that never burned, tended fires that responded to her will as if they were extensions of her own body. As the evening progressed and the guests grew drunk on wine and their own superiority, Mercy made her final preparations. She moved through the kitchen gathering ingredients that had nothing to do with cooking: lamp oil from the pantry, candles from the supply closet, lengths of rope that would burn fast and hot. She whispered to the flames in the cooking hearths, sharing her intentions with the element that had always understood her. At midnight, when the last guest had departed and the family had retired to their rooms, Mercy began her work. She started in the basement, where the house's foundation timbers were dry and old. She poured lamp oil along the wooden beams, soaked rope in the flammable liquid, and placed candles at strategic points throughout the cellar. But she didn't light them yet. Fire, she knew, was like any other weapon. Timing was everything. She moved through the house like a ghost, her small frame allowing her to slip through shadows and avoid the few servants still awake. She knew every creaking floorboard, every squeaking hinge, every sight line that might expose her presence. In each room she entered, she left behind the seeds of destruction: oil-soaked rags tucked behind furniture, candles positioned where their flames would catch curtains and tapestries, lengths of rope that would carry fire from room to room like a slow-burning fuse. By the time she finished, Ashford Manor was primed to burn like kindling. Every room was prepared, every escape route calculated, every member of the family positioned exactly where Mercy wanted them. She returned to the kitchen and stood before the great cooking hearth, raising her hands to the flames that had served her faithfully for so many months. "Tonight," she whispered to the fire, "we balance the scales." The flames seemed to hear her, leaping higher in response to her words. She reached into the hearth with her bare hands, cupping fire like water, feeling its heat caress her skin without causing harm. She whispered the old words her grandmother had taught her, words in a language that predated slavery, words that called upon powers older than chains and whips and human bondage. The fire answered. It spread from the hearth to the oil-soaked ropes, racing along the prepared paths like eager hunting hounds. It climbed the walls and ceiling, following the trails of lamp oil she had laid with such careful precision. It found the candles she had positioned throughout the house and lit them all at once, as if invisible hands were touching flame to wick in perfect synchronization. Within minutes, Ashford Manor was ablaze. The fire moved with intelligence and purpose, blocking certain doorways while leaving others clear, trapping some occupants while allowing others time to realize their danger. Silas Ashford woke to find his bedroom filled with smoke and his door handle too hot to touch. Eleanor screamed from her chamber as flames licked at her windows. Victoria and Thomas found themselves cut off from the main staircase, forced to flee toward rooms where fire waited to embrace them. And through it all, Mercy stood in the kitchen, untouched by flames that parted around her like the Red Sea. Her apron, which should have caught fire in the first moments of the blaze, remained pristine white despite the inferno surrounding her. Her hair, her skin, her clothes, nothing burned, nothing even smoldered. She was the calm center of a hurricane of destruction, a small, dark figure wreathed in flames that recognized her as their mistress. She watched through the kitchen windows as the family tried desperately to escape their burning home. She saw Silas attempt to climb from his bedroom window, only to fall 2 stories to the ground below with his nightclothes ablaze. She observed Eleanor's futile attempts to break through her bedroom door before the smoke overcame her. She witnessed Victoria and Thomas trapped in the library, clawing at windows that had been sealed shut by heat and smoke. But Mercy felt no pity, no regret, no human compassion for their suffering. These people had owned her body, if not her soul, had treated her as property rather than person, had built their comfort on the misery of those they considered less than human. As they had shown no mercy to their slaves, she would show none to them. The fire consumed everything: furniture and floors, walls and ceilings, memories and heirlooms accumulated over generations. It devoured the symbols of wealth built on bondage, the luxury purchased with blood money, the comfort that had insulated the Ashford family from the consequences of their cruelty. By dawn, nothing remained of the great manor house except smoking ruins and the blackened bones of those who had died within its walls. But Mercy remained untouched. When the neighbors arrived to fight the fire, they found her standing in what had been the kitchen, surrounded by the charred remains of walls and furniture, but completely unharmed. Her apron was still white, her hair still neat, her skin unmarked by smoke or flame. She looked up at them with calm eyes and explained that she had tried to wake the family, had attempted to help them escape, but the fire had spread too quickly. The neighbors believed her because they had to believe her. The alternative, that a small slave woman could command fire like a force of nature, could burn down a great house while standing untouched in the heart of the flames, was too impossible to accept. They saw what they expected to see: a fortunate survivor, a woman who had escaped death through luck or divine providence. The authorities investigated, naturally. Such a devastating fire, killing an entire prominent family, demanded explanation. They brought in experts who examined the ruins, questioned the surviving slaves, searched for evidence of arson or foul play, but they found nothing conclusive. No accelerants that shouldn't have been there, no signs of deliberate fire setting, no witnesses who could testify to seeing anything suspicious. Fire, they concluded, was an unpredictable destroyer. Old houses burned easily, especially in dry weather with wooden construction and multiple sources of ignition. The Ashford family had simply been unlucky, victims of one of those tragedies that claimed lives without reason or purpose. Only the slaves knew the truth, and they weren't about to share it with white authorities. They had seen Mercy's power, had witnessed justice served in the form of cleansing flame. Word spread through the slave community like wildfire itself. There was a woman among them who could call down divine retribution on their oppressors, who could balance the scales of justice with fire and determination. Mercy was sold again, this time to a small farmer who needed help with his modest household. She served him faithfully for 3 years, keeping his fires burning and his meals cooked, never giving him reason to suspect what she truly was. He was a decent man, as masters went, treating his few slaves with basic humanity, if not kindness. Mercy had no quarrel with him, no reason to visit fire upon his home. But word of her abilities had spread beyond Georgia, carried by the underground network of communication that connected slave communities across the South. Her reputation grew with each telling: the cook who could walk through fire, the woman whose apron never burned, the bringer of flame justice to those who deserved it. The stories reached a rice planter in South Carolina who had heard whispers about a woman who might solve his problems with rebellious slaves and mounting debts. He purchased Mercy at premium price, believing he was acquiring not just a skilled cook, but an enforcer who could maintain order through supernatural fear. He discovered too late that Mercy's power wasn't for hire. The rice plantation burned on a moonless night in 1862, when the Civil War was raging and the old order was already crumbling. The planter and his family perished in flames that consumed everything except the small woman who stood in the kitchen courtyard, her white apron glowing like a beacon in the darkness. By then, Mercy Blackwood had become legend. Slaves throughout the Confederacy whispered her name like a prayer, a promise that justice would eventually come for their oppressors, even if it came in the form of cleansing fire. She was the angel of retribution, the spirit of vengeance, the proof that some powers were older and stronger than the chains that bound human bodies. She continued moving from plantation to plantation, sometimes staying for years, sometimes for months, always departing after a mysterious fire claimed the lives of cruel masters or overseers. She never aged, never sickened, never showed any sign that time touched her the way it touched ordinary mortals. Fire was her fountain of youth, her source of strength, her eternal companion. The war ended, slavery was abolished, but Mercy's work wasn't finished. There were still men who needed to learn that cruelty carried consequences, still injustices that required the cleansing power of flame. She became a wanderer, appearing wherever evil wore the mask of respectability, wherever the powerful preyed upon the powerless with impunity. Some say she's still out there, a small woman with knowing eyes and hands that never burn, carrying fire in her heart and justice in her soul. They say you can recognize her by the white apron that stays clean, no matter what flames surround her, by the smile that promises retribution to those who deserve it. They say she appears in the kitchens of the cruel and heartless, offering her services as cook and fire tender. She serves them well at first, preparing meals that earn praise and keeping their hearths burning bright. But she watches, always watches, studying their character and judging their worthiness. And when judgment falls, it falls in fire. They say she laughs as the flames consume her victims, not from cruelty, but from joy, the joy of seeing balance restored to an unbalanced world, of watching those who showed no mercy receive none in return. Her laughter mingles with the crackle of burning wood and the screams of the condemned, a sound that speaks of justice, finally served. The old-timers in rural communities still warn about her, still tell stories of the cook whose apron never catches fire. They teach their children to be kind to servants, to treat all people with respect and dignity, because you never know when Mercy Blackwood might come to work in your kitchen. You never know when fire might reveal the truth of who you really are, because fire doesn't lie, and neither does justice. Both burn away pretense and deception, consuming everything false until only truth remains. And sometimes, when the powerful have ignored justice for too long, when mercy has been denied to those who needed it most, fire becomes the only teacher that evil will understand. They say her apron never caught fire because fire recognized its mistress. Flames acknowledge their queen. But perhaps there's a simpler truth. Perhaps her apron stayed white because it was meant to stay white, a symbol of purity in a world stained with cruelty, a beacon of hope for those who had given up believing that justice would ever come. In the end, they say, everyone gets exactly what they deserve. The cruel burn while the innocent are spared. The oppressor faces the flames while the oppressed find freedom. And somewhere in the smoke and ash, a small woman in a white apron smiles and moves on to the next kitchen, the next family, the next opportunity to balance the scales. Because fire, like justice, is patient. But when it finally arrives, it consumes everything in its path. And those who thought themselves beyond judgment learn too late that some powers are older than law, stronger than chains, and hungrier than any human appetite for cruelty. The cook laughs as the house burns, and her apron never catches fire. That's how you know justice has finally come home.